The sun shone brightly over the park in New Jersey, casting a warm glow on the lush green grass and colorful playground equipment. Children's laughter filled the air as they ran and played, their carefree spirits seemingly infectious to everyone around them. Amidst this joyful scene, 12-year-old Elijah sat on a wooden bench, his attention fully focused on the sketch pad in his lap. Elijah's hand moved swiftly across the paper, bringing to life the scenes before him. His dark eyes darted between his drawing and the playground, capturing the essence of the children's joy in quick, confident strokes. He was so engrossed in his art that he barely noticed the approaching footsteps. Officer Jack Thompson walked with purpose through the park, his blue uniform stark against the vibrant colors of the surroundings. His eyes scanned the area, eventually settling on Elijah. Without hesitation, he made his way toward the young boy. "Hey, you!" Jack called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" Elijah looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. He blinked, confusion evident on his face as he tried to process the officer's presence and tone. "I'm just drawing, sir," Elijah responded, his voice quieter than usual. He held up his sketch pad as if to prove his point. Jack's eyes narrowed as he looked at the drawing, then back at Elijah. "Let me see some ID," he demanded, ignoring the explanation. Elijah's confusion turned to anxiety. I don't have any ID. I'm only 12. Jack's posture stiffened. "Stand up," he ordered, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his handcuffs. Elijah complied, his movements slow and uncertain. His eyes darted around the park, searching for a familiar face, someone who could help explain the situation. The once cheerful atmosphere now felt tense and oppressive. "What's your name?" Jack pressed, taking a step closer to Elijah. "Elijah," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elijah King." Jack's eyebrows raised slightly at the surname, but he continued his questioning. "What are you really doing here, Elijah? Are you waiting for someone? Watching the other kids?" Elijah's heart raced as he tried to understand why he was being interrogated. "No, sir. I told you, I'm just drawing. This is where I always come to draw." Jack reached for Elijah's sketch pad. "Let me see that." As Jack's hand closed around the pad, a voice rang out across the park. "Elijah!" Both Elijah and Jack turned to see a man in a crisp suit striding purposefully towards them. Marcus King's face was a mask of concern and barely contained anger as he approached. Jack's demeanor changed instantly. He recognized Marcus King, a prominent lawyer known for his work on civil rights cases. The officer's hand dropped from Elijah's sketch pad, and he took a small step back. As Marcus reached them, he placed a protective hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Is there a problem here, officer?" he asked, his voice level but with an unmistakable edge. Jack hesitated, suddenly aware of the attention they were drawing from others in the park. Parents had stopped to watch, and a small crowd was beginning to form. "I was just asking the boy some questions," Jack said, his earlier confidence wavering. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "And what prompted these questions, Officer Thompson?" he asked, reading the name on Jack's badge. "What has my son done to warrant this interrogation?" The word interrogation hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jack shifted uncomfortably, aware that his actions were now under scrutiny. As Marcus waited for an answer, Elijah looked between his father and the officer. The tension was palpable, and he could sense that this encounter was about much more than just his afternoon of drawing in the park. The once peaceful scene had transformed into a crucible of social issues, with Elijah at its center. As more people gathered around, it became clear that this confrontation would not be easily resolved, and its impact would extend far beyond this sunny afternoon in the park. Marcus King stood tall, his presence commanding respect from those around him. His tailored suit and confident demeanor contrasted sharply with Jack Thompson's increasingly uncomfortable stance. The atmosphere in the park had shifted dramatically, the earlier sounds of children playing now muted by the tense confrontation unfolding. "Officer Thompson," Marcus began, his voice steady and controlled. "I'm still waiting for an explanation. What probable cause did you have to approach and question my son?" Jack's eyes darted between Marcus and Elijah, searching for words. "I was conducting a routine check of the area," he said, the rehearsed nature of his response evident. The boy's behavior seemed unusual. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Unusual? Drawing in a public park on a sunny afternoon is unusual?" His tone was measured, but the underlying anger was clear. "Or is there perhaps another reason you found my son's presence here unusual?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Several onlookers exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the subtext of Marcus's question. Jack straightened his posture, attempting to regain some authority. "Sir, I'm just doing my job, ensuring the safety of everyone in this park." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. "And how exactly does harassing a 12-year-old boy contribute to public safety, Officer Thompson?" The crowd around them had grown. Parents held their children close, teenagers stopped their games to watch, and elderly parkgoers leaned in to hear the exchange. The confrontation had become a spectacle, a live demonstration of the tensions that often simmered beneath the surface of their community. "I wasn't harassing anyone," Jack protested, his voice rising slightly. "I was asking questions, which is part of my duty." Marcus took a step closer to Jack, his voice lowering to ensure only those nearby could hear. "Let's be clear, officer. You saw a young black boy alone in the park and decided he was a threat. That's not duty, that's prejudice." Jack's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "You're twisting my words, Mr. King. I treat everyone equally." "Do you?" Marcus challenged. He turned to address the gathered crowd. "How many of you have been stopped by the police while simply enjoying this park?" Several hands went up, predominantly belonging to people of color. Marcus turned back to Jack. "Does that look like equal treatment to you?" Jack's jaw clenched, his earlier confidence completely eroded. He was no longer just facing Elijah or even Marcus. He was confronted by a community ready to voice years of pent-up frustrations. Elijah, still standing close to his father, watched the exchange with a mix of fear and fascination. He had heard his father speak about these issues before, but seeing him confront them in real time was different. It was both empowering and terrifying. Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone he often used in courtrooms. "Officer Thompson, the job of law enforcement is to protect and serve all members of the community, not to instill fear, not to perpetuate biases, and certainly not to make children feel unsafe in their own neighborhood." The crowd murmured in agreement. Jack looked around, suddenly aware of how isolated he had become. His hand instinctively moved towards his radio, but he stopped short of calling for backup. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved with more uniforms. "Mr. King," Jack started, his voice less certain now, "I understand your concerns, but you have to see this from my perspective. We have protocols—" Marcus cut him off. "Protocols that disproportionately target certain members of our community, protocols that assume guilt based on appearance. Those aren't protocols, Officer Thompson. They're symptoms of a deeper problem." As Marcus spoke, more people joined the gathering. Some pulled out phones, recording the interaction. What had started as a simple afternoon in the park had transformed into a moment that would likely be shared, discussed, and debated far beyond the confines of their neighborhood. The confrontation between Marcus King and Officer Jack Thompson had become a microcosm of a much larger societal issue, playing out in real time under the warm New Jersey sun, and at the center of it all stood Elijah, his sketchpad still clutched in his hands, a young witness to a pivotal moment in his community's history. As the tension between Marcus and Officer Thompson continued to build, the crowd around them grew larger and more vocal. People from all walks of life were drawn to the confrontation, sensing its importance beyond just this single incident. A woman in her mid-30s, holding the hand of her young daughter, stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her words carried a weight of long-held frustration. "I've lived here for 10 years, she began, drawing the attention of both Marcus and Jack, and I can't count the number of times I've been stopped or questioned for just existing in this neighborhood." Her statement seemed to open a floodgate of shared experiences. An elderly man nodded vigorously, adding, "It's not new, son. We've been dealing with this kind of treatment for generations." Jack shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the faces in the crowd. The united front of the community was palpable, and it was clear that this was no longer just about his interaction with Elijah. A teenager, wearing a hoodie with the logo of a local high school, pushed his way to the front. His eyes were fixed on Marcus, a mix of admiration and determination in his gaze. "Mr. King," he said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion, "I've read about your cases. You fight for people like us. But what can we do? How do we fight this every day?" Marcus turned to the young man, his expression softening. "The first step is exactly this," he said, gesturing to the gathered crowd. "Speaking up, standing together, and refusing to let these incidents go unchallenged." As the community members shared their stories, the atmosphere in the park transformed. What had started as a confrontation was evolving into an impromptu forum on race, policing, and community relations. Officer Thompson, initially defensive, found himself listening to story after story of mistreatment, profiling, and fear. His posture gradually changed from rigid defensiveness to something more open, more receptive. A middle-aged teacher spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Officer, we're not here to attack you personally, but you represent a system that has failed many of us. Can you understand why seeing you approach a young boy like Elijah triggers such a response from this community?" Jack nodded slowly, the weight of the community's collective experience beginning to sink in. I never intended to cause harm," he said, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "We're trained to be vigilant, to look for anything out of the ordinary." "But that's just it," Marcus interjected. "Why is a black child enjoying a public space considered out of the ordinary? That's the bias we're talking about, Officer Thompson. It's so ingrained that you might not even recognize it." The crowd murmured in agreement. Parents hugged their children closer. Teenagers nodded solemnly, and older community members exchanged knowing glances. This was a conversation they had been waiting to have for a long time. Elijah, still standing close to his father, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. He had always been aware of the issues his father fought against, but seeing it play out in real time in his own neighborhood made it all the more real. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, raised her hand timidly. "I'm training to be a teacher," she said. "How do we make sure the next generation doesn't have to face these same issues? How do we break this cycle?" Her question hung in the air, a challenge to everyone present. It was no longer just about this one incident, but about the future they all wanted to build. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, the gathering showed no signs of dispersing. What had started as a tense confrontation had evolved into something more powerful. A community coming together, sharing their experiences, and demanding change. The park, once filled with the simple sounds of children playing, now buzzed with the energy of a community finding its collective voice. And at the center of it all stood Elijah, Marcus, and Officer Thompson, three individuals whose chance encounter had sparked a moment of reckoning for an entire neighborhood. As the community continued to share their experiences and concerns, Elijah, who had been quietly observing the unfolding scene, suddenly felt a surge of courage. He tugged gently on his father's sleeve, his eyes conveying a silent request to speak. Marcus, recognizing the determination in his son's face, nodded encouragingly. "I think my son has something to say," he announced, placing a supportive hand on Elijah's shoulder. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to the young boy who had inadvertently become the catalyst for this impromptu community gathering. Elijah took a deep breath, his hands clutching his sketchpad tightly. I just wanted to draw," Elijah began, his voice soft but steady. "This park, it's not just a place to play. For me, it's where I come to create, to express myself." He held up his sketchpad, flipping through pages filled with vibrant drawings of the park, its visitors, and the life teeming within it. "Every person I draw has a story," he continued, gaining confidence with each word. "I don't see threats when I look around. I see inspiration. I see beauty in our differences." The crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Even Officer Thompson's stern expression softened as he watched Elijah speak. "I want to be an artist when I grow up," Elijah said, his voice growing stronger. "But moments like today, they make me wonder if I'll always be seen as suspicious first and an artist second." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth that seemed beyond his years. Several parents in the crowd exchanged glances, a mix of pride and sadness in their eyes, as they recognized the burden their children carried. "Art is my way of resisting," Elijah continued, surprising even his father with his eloquence. "When I draw, I show the world as I see it, full of color, life, and possibility, not fear and suspicion." As Elijah spoke, a transformation seemed to occur in the gathering. The anger and frustration that had initially fueled the confrontation began to give way to something else, a sense of hope, of potential for change. A woman in the crowd wiped away a tear. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured, loud enough for those around her to hear. Officer Thompson, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. His posture had changed, the authoritative stance replaced by something more humble. "Elijah," he said, his voice softer than before, "may I see your drawings?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, looking to his father for guidance. Marcus nodded, and Elijah cautiously handed his sketchpad to the officer. As Thompson flipped through the pages, his expression changed. The park he had patrolled countless times came to life through Elijah's eyes, diverse, vibrant, and full of joy. He saw families of all backgrounds enjoying picnics, elderly couples feeding pigeons, teenagers skateboarding, all coexisting peacefully on Elijah's pages. "This is remarkable," Thompson said, genuine admiration in his voice. He looked at Elijah, then at the crowd around him. "I think I've been looking at things the wrong way for a long time." Elijah's bravery in speaking up seemed to have pierced through layers of ingrained bias and procedure. His art and his words had humanized the very people that Thompson had been viewing with suspicion. As the sketchpad made its way through the crowd, with people murmuring appreciatively at Elijah's talent, the atmosphere in the park continued to shift. What had started as a confrontation was evolving into a moment of community connection and understanding. Marcus looked at his son with a mix of pride and a tinge of sadness, recognizing that Elijah's innocence had been challenged today, but his spirit had risen to meet that challenge. The young boy's voice had become a catalyst for change, his art a bridge between diverse experiences. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the gathering, it was clear that this day in the park had become more than just an incident. It was a moment of awakening, a spark of change, all initiated by a young boy with a sketchpad and a dream. As Elijah's sketchpad continued to circulate through the crowd, the initial tension gave way to a more nuanced and passionate discussion. The park, once a backdrop for recreation, had transformed into an impromptu forum for addressing deep-seated issues within the community. Marcus, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stepped forward. "What we're witnessing here," he began, his voice carrying the weight of years of legal experience, "is a microcosm of a much larger issue. It's not just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that perpetuates bias and fear." His words ignited a flurry of responses from the gathered crowd. A middle-aged man in a business suit spoke up, his voice tinged with frustration. "But isn't law enforcement necessary for maintaining order? We can't just ignore potential threats." This comment sparked immediate pushback from several community members. A young woman with vibrant purple hair countered, "The question is, who gets to decide what a potential threat looks like? And why does it always seem to be people who look like Elijah?" The debate began to heat up, with voices rising and overlapping. Officer Thompson, still holding Elijah's sketchpad, looked increasingly uncomfortable as he found himself at the center of a community's long-suppressed grievances. An elderly woman, leaning on a cane, raised her hand to speak. The crowd quieted, respecting her age and the wisdom it implied. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 60 years, she began, her voice quavering but determined. "I've seen the civil rights movement, I've seen promises of change, and I've seen those promises broken time and time again." She turned to face Officer Thompson directly. "Young man, I don't blame you personally, but you represent a system that has failed us for generations. It's time for real change, not just empty words." Her statement was met with murmurs of agreement and a few scattered claps. The officer shifted his weight, clearly wrestling with internal conflict. A teacher from the local high school stepped forward. "We need to address this at its root," she asserted. "Education is key. We need to teach our children, all our children, about bias, about history, about the experiences of marginalized communities." This sparked a heated exchange about the role of education versus law enforcement in addressing societal issues. Some argued for increased funding for schools and community programs, while others emphasized the need for police reform and accountability. Throughout the debate, Marcus maintained a calm demeanor, occasionally interjecting to keep the discussion focused and productive. Elijah, still standing close to his father, watched with a mix of awe and concern as the adults around him grappled with issues that directly affected his life. As the discussion continued, personal stories began to emerge. A young man shared his experience of being repeatedly stopped and frisked on his way home from work. A mother tearfully recounted how her son had been arrested for simply hanging out with friends in front of their own home. These personal accounts added emotional weight to the intellectual arguments being made. Even those who had initially defended the current system found themselves reconsidering their positions in light of these heartfelt testimonies. Officer Thompson, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke up. I never realized the extent of the impact our actions have," he admitted, his voice tinged with a mix of shame and dawning understanding. "We're trained to look for threats, but maybe we need to be trained to see people first." His words, tentative as they were met with a moment of silence, followed by nods of cautious approval from some members of the crowd. It was a small step, but a significant one. As the debate continued, with voices rising and falling, it became clear that this incident in the park had tapped into a wellspring of emotion and frustration within the community. The conversation was difficult, often uncomfortable, but undeniably necessary. The sun was now low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. Yet no one seemed inclined to leave. This impromptu gathering had become more than a reaction to a single incident. It had evolved into a crucial dialogue about justice, equality, and the future of their community. As night began to fall, the park lights flickered on, illuminating the faces of a community united in their desire for change, even if they disagreed on how to achieve it. The debate showed no signs of slowing down, each voice adding another layer to a complex and vital conversation. As the heated debate continued, Officer Jack Thompson found himself stepping away from the center of the crowd. He moved to the edge of the gathering, his mind reeling from the barrage of perspectives and experiences he'd just heard. Finding a quiet spot near a large oak tree, he leaned against its trunk, his eyes unfocused as he stared across the now dimly lit park. Jack's thoughts drifted to his childhood in a small, predominantly white town. He remembered the simplicity of his upbringing, the unquestioned trust in authority, and the clear-cut notions of right and wrong that had been instilled in him. Now, those certainties were crumbling under the weight of the community's collective voice. He recalled his police academy training, the emphasis on vigilance and threat assessment. But now, he wondered, had that training inadvertently reinforced biases he didn't even know he held? The faces of countless individuals he'd stopped over the years flashed through his mind, and he felt a growing discomfort as he realized the pattern in those faces. Meanwhile, Marcus observed Jack's retreat with a mixture of concern and hope. He turned to Elijah, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. Elijah looked up at his father, his young face etched with a maturity beyond his years. "I'm okay, Dad," he replied. "I never knew so many people felt the same way we do. It's scary, but kind of amazing too." Marcus nodded, a proud smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You showed incredible courage today, son. Your voice, your art, they made a real impact." As father and son shared this moment, the debate around them continued to swirl. Community members were now discussing concrete steps for change, proposals for civilian oversight committees, increased diversity in law enforcement, and expanded community outreach programs. Marcus watched the engaged faces around him, feeling a surge of pride in his community. What had started as a potentially dangerous confrontation had transformed into a catalyst for change. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but this moment, this unity, gave him hope. Back by the oak tree, Jack's introspection deepened. He thought about his own experiences with discrimination, subtle jabs about his working-class background at the police academy, dismissive comments about his rural upbringing. While not the same as racial prejudice, these memories helped him begin to empathize with the frustrations expressed by the community. As the night grew darker, the energy in the park began to shift. The heated arguments of earlier had given way to more thoughtful discussions, small groups forming to exchange ideas and experiences. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of possibility, of potential change on the horizon. Elijah, feeling emboldened by the day's events, tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, can I show Officer Thompson more of my drawings? Maybe if he sees how I see the world, it'll help him understand." Marcus hesitated for a moment, his protective instincts flaring. But seeing the determination in his son's eyes, he nodded. "All right, but I'm coming with you." As they approached Jack, still lost in thought by the oak tree, Marcus cleared his throat. Jack looked up, surprise and a hint of wariness in his eyes. "Officer Thompson," Marcus began, his tone measured but not unkind. "Elijah has something he'd like to share with you." Elijah stepped forward, holding out his sketch pad. "I want to show you more of my drawings, sir. I want you to see our community the way I see it." Jack straightened up, his expression softening as he looked at the young boy he had so rashly judged earlier. He reached out, carefully taking the sketchpad. "I'd be honored, Elijah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As Jack began to flip through the pages, the park around them continued to buzz with the energy of a community awakened. The night was far from over, and the conversations taking place would echo far beyond this single evening. In this moment of personal connection between Elijah, Marcus, and Jack, the first fragile threads of understanding began to weave themselves into the fabric of their shared community. As Jack Thompson flipped through Elijah's sketchbook, his expression changed from curiosity to amazement. Each page revealed a vibrant, diverse community full of life and harmony, a stark contrast to the suspicious lens through which he had viewed the park earlier that day. After several minutes of silent observation, Jack closed the sketchbook and looked up at Elijah and Marcus. His face was a mixture of emotions: shame, understanding, and a glimmer of determination. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and addressed the crowd that had gathered around them. "I owe all of you an apology," Jack began, his voice carrying across the now quiet park. "Especially you, Elijah." He turned to the young boy. "What I did today was wrong. I let my biases and preconceptions cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I not only failed you, but failed this entire community." A hush fell over the gathering as people leaned in to hear Jack's words. Some exchanged surprised glances, while others nodded encouragingly. "I became a police officer because I wanted to protect and serve," Jack continued, his voice growing stronger. "But today, I realized that I've been part of a system that has caused fear and pain instead. That ends now." Jack turned to face Marcus. "Mr. King, I want to learn. I want to do better. Not just me, but our entire department. We need to change, and we need the community's help to do it." Marcus, surprised by Jack's sincerity, nodded slowly. "That's a commendable start, Officer Thompson, but words need to be backed by actions." "You're absolutely right," Jack agreed. He addressed the crowd again. "I commit here and now to enrolling in bias training programs. I'll advocate for these programs to be mandatory for our entire force. But more than that, I want to establish regular community meetings, not just to police, but to listen and learn from all of you." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman spoke up. "And how do we know this isn't just talk? We've heard promises before." Jack nodded, acknowledging the skepticism. "You're right to be doubtful. That's why I'm going to give you my badge number and my supervisor's contact information. I want you all to hold me accountable. If you see me or any of my colleagues failing to live up to this commitment, report it. Change has to start somewhere, and I'm willing to be that starting point." As Jack spoke, the atmosphere in the park shifted. The tension that had permeated the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. People in the crowd began to nod, some even offering words of encouragement. A young activist stepped forward. "Officer Thompson, we appreciate your words, but we need systemic change. Will you support our calls for increased community oversight and policy reform?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Yes, I will. I realize now that true safety comes from trust and understanding, not from fear and intimidation. I'll support your efforts and use my position to advocate for change within the department." As Jack made these commitments, Elijah tugged on his father's sleeve. Marcus leaned down to hear his son's whispered request, then straightened up with a smile. "Officer Thompson," Marcus said, "Elijah has a request. He'd like to organize an art workshop for police officers and community members to create together. Would you be willing to participate and help coordinate this with your department?" Jack's face lit up. "Elijah, that's a brilliant idea. I'd be honored to help make that happen." The crowd erupted in applause, not thunderous, but genuine. It was a small step, but a significant one. As the applause died down, people began to approach Jack, some offering handshakes, others sharing their own stories and suggestions. As the night wore on, the park that had earlier been a site of confrontation had transformed into a space of dialogue and tentative reconciliation. The path ahead was long and undoubtedly challenging, but in that moment, under the soft glow of the park lights, a community had taken its first steps towards meaningful change. Marcus put his arm around Elijah's shoulders, watching as Officer Thompson engaged with community members. "You did good today, son," he said softly. "You did real good." Elijah beamed up at his father, clutching his sketchbook to his chest. In that moment, he realized that his art could be more than just drawings. It could be a bridge, a catalyst for change. And he was ready to keep drawing, to keep showing the world as he saw it, full of color, diversity, and hope. As the evening deepened, the park's atmosphere transformed once again. The heated debates and emotional testimonies gradually gave way to a sense of collective exhaustion and cautious optimism. The golden hues of sunset had long since faded, replaced by the soft glow of street lamps and the distant twinkle of stars. People began to disperse in small groups, their conversations now hushed but still intense. Parents collected their children, some of whom had fallen asleep on blankets spread on the grass. Teenagers exchanged contact information, making plans to continue their discussions on social media. The elderly members of the community were escorted home by younger neighbors, the bonds of community visibly strengthened by the day's events. Marcus and Elijah found themselves on a quiet bench at the edge of the park. The wooden slats were cool against their backs, a gentle reminder of the hours that had passed since this extraordinary afternoon began. They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the day's events. Elijah was the first to break the silence. "Dad," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of excitement and uncertainty, "do you think anything will really change?" Marcus turned to his son, studying the young face that seemed to have aged years in a single afternoon. He chose his words carefully. "Change is never easy or quick, Elijah. What happened today is just the beginning. But yes, I believe things can change. You helped make that possible." Elijah nodded slowly, processing his father's words. He looked down at his sketchbook, running his fingers over the worn cover. "I never thought my drawings could make a difference like this," he mused. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Art has always been a powerful force for change, son. Your drawings showed Officer Thompson and others a perspective they hadn't considered before. That's how change begins, by opening people's eyes to new possibilities." As they talked, Officer Jack Thompson approached their bench. He looked tired, but resolute. "Mr. King, Elijah," he said, nodding to each of them, "I just wanted to thank you both before I left. This day, it's changed me. I have a lot to think about, a lot to work on." Marcus stood, extending his hand to Jack. "Change is a journey, Officer Thompson. What matters is that you've taken the first step." Jack shook Marcus's hand firmly, then turned to Elijah. "And thank you, young man. Your courage and your art, they've taught me more than years of police training ever did." Elijah, emboldened by the day's events, stood up straight and looked Jack in the eye. "Will you really help with the art workshop idea?" Jack's face broke into a genuine smile. "Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to propose it to my superiors first thing tomorrow. I think it could be the start of something important." As Jack said his goodbyes and walked away, Elijah and Marcus watched him go. The park was nearly empty now, the last few stragglers making their way home under the starlit sky. "Come on, son," Marcus said softly. "It's time we headed home too. Your mother will be wondering where we've been all this time." As they gathered their things and began to walk home, Elijah felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride, hope, and a new sense of responsibility swirled in his young mind. He clutched his sketchbook tightly, already imagining the new drawings he would create. Drawings of a community coming together, of barriers being broken down, of hope taking root. Marcus, sensing his son's introspective mood, draped an arm around Elijah's shoulders as they walked. "You know, Elijah," he said, "days like today are what change is made of. Small moments that add up to something bigger. Always remember that you have the power to create those moments." Elijah nodded, leaning into his father's embrace. As they walked home under the canopy of stars, both father and son knew that while the journey ahead would be challenging, they had witnessed the birth of something powerful in their community. And Elijah, with his sketchbook full of dreams and his heart full of determination, was ready to play his part in shaping that future. The park fell quiet behind them, but the echoes of the day's events would resonate far beyond its borders, touching lives and inspiring change in ways they had yet to imagine. In the days following the incident at the park, the ripple effects of that fateful afternoon began to spread throughout the community. What had started as a tense confrontation between Officer Jack Thompson and young Elijah King had blossomed into a catalyst for change that touched every corner of their town. The local media was quick to pick up on the story. The evening news led with a segment titled "Art and Justice: How a Young Boy's Sketchbook Sparked a Community Dialogue." Clips of the impromptu gathering in the park, including Elijah's heartfelt speech and Officer Thompson's public apology, were broadcast into homes across the region. Social media platforms buzzed with activity as community members shared their experiences from that day. Hashtags like "Mudgear Elijah's Vision" and "Community Over Conflict" trended locally, sparking wider discussions about racial profiling and community policing. At the police department, Officer Thompson made good on his promises. He approached his superiors with a comprehensive proposal for bias training and community engagement programs. While initially met with skepticism, the viral nature of the park incident and the positive public response to Thompson's actions eventually swayed the department leadership. Within a week, the police chief announced a series of town hall meetings to address community concerns and discuss potential reforms. The first meeting, held at the local high school auditorium, was packed to capacity. Community members from all walks of life came to voice their opinions, share their experiences, and contribute to the development of new policing strategies. Marcus King, recognized for his role in facilitating the dialogue at the park, was invited to serve on a newly formed civilian oversight committee. He accepted the position, seeing it as an opportunity to effect real change from within the system. Elijah, meanwhile, found himself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. His art teacher, inspired by the story, organized a special exhibition of student artwork focused on themes of community, justice, and equality. Elijah's sketches from the park incident were featured prominently, drawing visitors from across the town and even neighboring communities. The proposed art workshop, born from Elijah's idea, gained traction rapidly. Local artists volunteered their time, and several police officers, led by Thompson, signed up to participate. The first session was scheduled for the following month, with plans to make it a regular event if successful. Schools in the district began incorporating discussions about racial bias and community relations into their curricula. Guest speakers, including Marcus King and Reformed Officer Thompson, were invited to share their perspectives with students. Not everyone in the community embraced these changes wholeheartedly. There were voices of dissent, concerns about undermining police authority, and skepticism about the lasting impact of these initiatives. However, the momentum for change proved stronger than the resistance. As weeks passed, subtle but significant shifts began to occur. Community members reported feeling more comfortable approaching police officers with concerns. Officers, in turn, spoke of a growing sense of connection to the people they served. The us versus them mentality that had long characterized police-community relations began to erode, replaced by a tentative but growing sense of mutual respect and understanding. Elijah, for his part, continued to draw, his sketchbook filled with new visions of his community, images of police officers and civilians working side by side, of diverse groups coming together in celebration, of bridges being built where walls once stood. His art, once a personal passion, had become a powerful tool for visualizing the change his community was striving to achieve. 1 month after the incident, a community picnic was held in the same park where it all began. As families spread blankets on the grass and children played, there was a palpable sense of progress. Officer Thompson, off duty and in civilian clothes, could be seen chatting amiably with community members. Marcus King moved through the crowd, engaging in discussions about the next steps for community reform. And at the center of it all was Elijah, perched on a bench with his ever-present sketchbook, capturing the scene before him. As he drew, he realized that the park and his community no longer felt like a place of tension and fear. Instead, it had become a canvas of possibility, a place where the seeds of change planted on that fateful afternoon were beginning to take root and grow. As the sun set on the picnic, casting a warm glow over the gathered community, there was a shared sense that while the journey was far from over, they had taken the first crucial steps together towards a more just and united future. 6 months after the incident in the park, the community had settled into a new rhythm. The initial fervor of change had given way to the steady work of implementing and maintaining new policies and relationships. Progress was slow but tangible, with community police relations showing marked improvement. On a crisp autumn morning, Elijah and Marcus were preparing for the monthly art workshop, now a staple of community engagement. As they gathered supplies, Marcus's phone buzzed with an urgent news alert. His expression turned grave as he read the message. "Elijah," he said, his voice tense, "we need to get to the community center right away." Upon arrival, they found the center in chaos. A crowd had gathered around a large screen displaying a local news broadcast. The headline read, "Shocking Video Reveals Pattern of Racial Profiling by Local Police." The video, captured by a bystander's phone, showed Officer Jack Thompson involved in a series of confrontations with minority residents over the past year. The incidents predated the park encounter with Elijah, but the pattern was clear and deeply troubling. As the community watched in stunned silence, the news anchor detailed an investigation that had uncovered multiple complaints against Thompson and several other officers. The park incident with Elijah, it seemed, was just the tip of the iceberg. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Those who had been skeptical of Thompson's change of heart felt vindicated, while others who had embraced the promise of reform felt betrayed and disillusioned. Marcus, recognizing the gravity of the situation, immediately called an emergency meeting of the Civilian Oversight Committee. As he left for the meeting, he noticed Elijah sitting quietly in a corner, sketchbook open but untouched. "Son," he said gently, "I know this is hard to understand, but remember, change is a process. Sometimes we take steps backward before we can move forward again." Elijah nodded silently, his young mind grappling with the complexity of the situation. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Protests erupted outside the police station, demanding accountability and systemic change. The police chief, under intense pressure, announced a full investigation and placed Thompson and the other implicated officers on administrative leave. In a surprising turn of events, Thompson reached out to Marcus, requesting a chance to address the community. After much deliberation, a town hall meeting was arranged. The atmosphere in the packed auditorium was tense as Thompson took the stage. His face was drawn, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes. "I stand before you today, not to make excuses, but to take full responsibility for my actions," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "The man you saw in that video is who I was, not who I am trying to become. My experience with Elijah and this community opened my eyes, but I realize now that change doesn't happen overnight." He went on to detail the ingrained biases and systemic issues within the department, offering to testify in any investigation. "I am willing to face the consequences of my past actions," he concluded. "But I also ask for the opportunity to be part of the solution, to work towards genuine reform from the inside." The community's reaction was mixed. Some called for immediate dismissal, while others advocated for a restorative justice approach. In the midst of this turmoil, Elijah found his voice once again. With his father's encouragement, He asked to speak at the next community meeting. Standing before the crowd, his sketchbook clutched to his chest, Elijah spoke with a wisdom beyond his years. "I drew Officer Thompson as I hoped he could be," he said, holding up a sketch. "But I also need to draw the truth of what happened. We all need to see clearly to make things better." Elijah's words resonated deeply. His ability to hold both hope and hard truth inspired the community to approach the situation with nuance and determination. In the weeks that followed, significant changes were implemented. A rigorous retraining program was established for all officers, with a focus on bias recognition and community engagement. The Civilian Oversight Committee was given expanded powers, and a transparent complaint system was put in place. Thompson, after facing disciplinary action, became an advocate for police reform, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and a call to action in police academies across the state. Elijah, now recognized as a voice for change, was invited to display his art at City Hall. His exhibition, titled Drawing Change, featured sketches documenting the community's journey, the good, the bad, and the in-between. As Marcus and Elijah stood in the gallery, surrounded by images of struggle and hope, Marcus put his arm around his son's shoulders. "You've helped create real change, Elijah," he said proudly. "It's not perfect, and the work is far from over, but you've shown us all the power of seeing clearly and dreaming boldly." Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning the room filled with community members, police officers, and city officials, all engaged in earnest conversation. He turned to a blank page in his sketchbook and began to draw, capturing not just what he saw, but what he hoped his community could become. The story of Elijah, Marcus, and their community had become more than a local incident. It had evolved into a testament to the complex, challenging, but ultimately hopeful journey toward justice and understanding. As night fell on the city, the lights of the gallery illuminated Elijah's drawings, beacons of a future still being sketched, one stroke at a time.